By the 1970s, Major League Hockey seemed creaky and stale. The National Hockey League had monopolized the market for decades, and it lagged behind the rest of the changing sports landscape. The World Hockey Association changed all of that. In 1972, it shocked the sports establishment by stealing the NHL's reigning superstar, Bobby Hull, and then raiding other NHL clubs of their top talent. The WHA also smashed the tradition button-down image of professional ice hockey and embraced the funky disco beat of the 1970s. WHA players sprouted long hair and afros, and they weren't afraid to express their individuality. On the ice, the WHA introduced regular season overtime and offensive-minded rules that we take for granted today. It wasn't always pretty, but ice hockey was fun in the World Hockey Association.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, friends, buckle up for safety. Here we are. It's the World Hockey Association on this week's episode. We welcome you to it. My name is Tim Hanlon, and of course, this is Good Seats Still Available, that curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. The voice that you heard there, especially if you live or have grown up in the Indianapolis, Indiana area of the United States, of course, is the legacy dulcet tones of Mr. Bob Lamey, who not only is today the voice of the Indianapolis Colts and was for a time the voice of the Pacers and a whole bunch of other things, but one of his first gigs was calling the games for the WHA's Indianapolis Racers. And as we get into our second little excursion into the WHA, and of course we got that underway with our pal Ed Willis a few episodes back with his book, The Rebel League, we're going to go a little deeper with Tim here. Tim Gassen, as you may know, is the proprietor of, the founder of, the curator of the idea generator behind an amazing comprehensive site and trove of information known as the WHA Hall of Fame. It's at WHAHOF.com, and it actually got its start from his childhood memories and passion for the Indianapolis Racers, which we heard in the clip that preceded my little ramblings here. And that clip actually came from one of the many documentaries that Tim Gassen has put together under the umbrella of the World Hockey Association Hall of Fame. That documentary is called Red, White, and Blues, Indianapolis Racers Hockey, and it is just one of a few scores, actually, of documentaries, video, game footage, some of which you'll find on the site, some of which is available for purchase in DVD and Blu-ray form. But also, Tim and his team have put together a whole host of publications as well, books recounting various team histories, including that of the Indianapolis Racers and some others, but also some amazing recreations and reproductions of some of the original source material from the old WHA itself. A couple of books actually are, and we'll have all these posted on our website, of course, with this episode description. But these books that Tim and team have put out, they actually include the original content from the original game programs of the WHA back in the day that have been sort of locked into these dusty old publications that have never sort of seen the digital light of day. And also, what I think is especially fascinating are direct and exact and lovingly recreated where needed reproductions of the actual media guides of the teams themselves. And again, this is we're talking about a league that lasted from 1972 to 79. So we're talking, I don't know, a couple of dozen teams, some of which, didn't last full seasons and stuff. But there's an amazing assemblage there of great content that has never really been seen before unless you've been a collector or a hoarder of some of those original publications from back in the day. But our conversation with Tim Gassen coming up, this is sort of our, sophomore level class on the WHA, and gets into some of the ins and outs of collecting this stuff, preserving it. We get into some interesting chats about how lovingly embraced and or ignored and pushed aside the WHA and its history is with, say, folks like the National Hockey League and various halls of fame and stuff. This is a very fun conversation. I urge you to sit back and to relax, but indeed make sure that seatbelt is buckled tightly in case of any bumps along the way, because there will certainly be a few as we get through our conversation. But before we do that, I want to remind you of two great sponsors that are extremely relevant for this conversation, because both places are going to have quite a bit of WHA stuff that would be perfect to listen to this episode with, or be incentivized to go and purchase after you've heard this episode, and perhaps re-listen to it a couple of times because it's that good. One, of course, is our old friends at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Sportshistorycollectibles.com is the place to go to find a tremendous trove of memorabilia, some of those original game programs that we referenced before, media guides and pennants and buttons and you name it, all kinds of souvenirs from the past in teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, or just that were previously incarnated. Our friend Dean Mitchell and friends at sportshistorycollectibles.com, they're putting new stuff up there just about every week. It was a wonderful photography of all these items, and I'm pretty sure you're going to find something that you're going to be really interested in and want to own for yourself. And of course, when you do so, you do determine that. Make sure you use the promo code GOODSEATS at checkout and get 15% off all of your purchases. SportsHistoryCollectibles.com, promo code GOODSEATS to get your 15% discount on all the great stuff available for purchase at SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. And once you're done there, I want you to then point your web browser to this URL, and that's oldschoolshirts.com. Oldschoolshirts.com. Yes, just exactly how it sounds. That's how it's spelled. You want to check that out. Our friend P.F. Wilson there and his friends in the Cincinnati, Ohio area have a dramatic and awesome assemblage of all kinds of shirts that have the logos that you love and remember, and in stylish shirts and in distressed looks and feels, high quality stuff. And you're going to find a whole bunch of World Hockey Association logos and teams and shirts there to amaze your friends and stun the youngins with your knowledge of hockey history. So make sure you check out the WHA and hockey areas of oldschoolshirts.com. And make sure, of course, that you use the promo code there. That's also Good Seats. That's that promo code, Good Seats, for 10% off of your purchases there as well. That's at oldschoolshirts.com. Use that promo code, Good Seats, for 10% off of all of your purchases. And we thank them as well for their patronage and their support of our show. And we appreciate you listening to our fine interview with our new friend, Tim Gassen. He, the proprietor and the originator of the World Hockey Association Hall of Fame, and a whole bunch of memorable content and remembrances of a dynamite league known as the WHA. And here is our chat now. One of the more sort of passionate sets of episodes that we've done thus far is around hockey. And we did scratch the surface a couple of weeks ago with Ed Willis and his book about the WHA. But, you know, I don't, from my research, it doesn't seem like there's anybody out there who is, I guess, more synonymous with sort of keeping the legacy and the history and the memories alive of the old WHA than you. And I want to start really with how you even got into this this league, the whole idea, and keeping it alive. Just, you know, to give our audience a sense of sort of where your passion and all your activities coming from.
Well, Tim, passion is absolutely the word. This fall we'll be celebrating the 10th anniversary of the World Hockey Association Hall of Fame. As you know, that's 3 years longer than the league itself existed. So I have the help of some other passionate people, but where it all stems from is the fact that I grew up as a youngster with the league in Indianapolis, Indiana. I followed the NHL, but then we got this WHA franchise, the Indianapolis Racers. And Indianapolis was very much the poster child for a new market for the World Hockey Association, bringing Major League Hockey to cities that never had it before. Places like Hartford, Connecticut, and Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Edmonton. I was enthralled by this hockey team. So it became the first hockey team that I followed fervently in person as a kid. Now, I'm the same age as Wayne Gretzky, so I got to see him come to Indianapolis. We were the same age. And of course, that was fascinating. Even at that point, he was famous as a 17-year-old, being paid more than $1 million to play hockey in the World Hockey Association. So that's how initially I was excited about it. As an adult then, going into media, I became a journalist and a filmmaker. I noticed that there was no one really doing the documentation and kind of archive work needed to make sure that the history of the World Hockey Association survived. And so I started to contact former owners of WHA teams, coaches, players, fans, other media members who covered the team back in the day, and we put together the World Hockey Association Hall of Fame. I'm excited that enough people were interested in this history that we're able to continue to this day and get a heck of a lot done in this last 10 years.
Well, so before we sort of get into sort of more of the origins of your fandom and that sort of got it all going, the World Hockey Association Hall of Fame, it's an actual thing, an actual physical repository, or is it co-located somewhere? Give our audience a sense of what this thing is that you've built, essentially.
Well, we're very proud that we're very modern in the way that we have a very substantial website that has a lot of free materials, the largest statistical database of WHA materials that's available anywhere, and that's free to look at, a lot of video, a lot of feature articles, stuff like that. But we're also delighted that we have an actual physical museum display. Our official display is at the United States Hockey Hall of Fame, which is in Minnesota. And so that's the National Hall of Fame for all of American hockey, and we're on the second floor. We're delighted to be there. We have a very large display there, and we're excited that we have a permanent exhibit at the United States Hockey Hall of Fame. Besides that, and the websites, we operate social media sites, and I do reunions and showings of the documentaries that we've produced, and player events all over North America, all over Canada and the United States. And that's the main way that we go and celebrate in different cities that had WHA teams, their history and some of these wonderful characters who inhabited the WHA.
Yeah, we're going to tout these websites early and often during the course of the of this episode, and at the beginning and the end of it too, in our pre and post recordings. But the website, the one of the websites that you need to bookmark early and often is WHAHOF, as in Hall of Fame.com, WHAHOF.com. And the United States Hall of Fame Museum, the United States Hockey Hall of Fame Museum is in, is it Eveleth, Minnesota? Is that how they pronounce it?
Yeah, Eveleth, Minnesota, which is north of Minneapolis, and it's in the most famous area for American hockey players. There's two great areas of places where historically where American hockey players have come out of in the New England area, and right around Eveleth, Minnesota, in rural Minnesota. It's called the Iron Belt. Half of the U.S. 1980 Olympic team came from right around Eveleth, and WHA players came from the Iron Belt right around the Eveleth area. And so it's a beautiful building, a wonderful place to go visit in Eveleth, north of Minneapolis. And we're really excited to be there. But, everyone can't make it to rural Minnesota, so that's why we like to go around and have events. We've had events at the Toronto Hall of Fame, events in Calgary and in Winnipeg, and then closer to home here in the United States as well. And I'm in Tucson, Arizona, so if I can create and grow the World Hockey Association Hall of Fame living in Tucson, Arizona, then I'm telling you, Tim, anything is possible in sports.
See, and that's it. And that is passion beyond the call of duty. All right. Before we get off the Hall of Fame idea, this is actually something that has popped up in some of our other sports exploits. And I'm really curious to sort of, I guess, sort of twin questions here. One, how were you able to achieve, some kind of relationship with a broader Hall of Fame, a professional or sport, in this case, U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame relationship? And then related, what has been the relationship or if any, with folks in the NHL regarding, let's say, the history and the background of the WHA? Because I think in both cases, and again, we've seen this with other sports, with other folks trying to memorialize leagues that have come and gone, is almost sort of like a, how can I best put it, a willful ignorance or a desire to almost not remember because of either failure or it was a challenging time, let's say, for the halls of fame or leagues, whatever, that wound up sort of winning out or were still left standing. So maybe you've got some answers to those questions.
Yeah, for the first part, my background in media and also hockey really helped me to establish the legitimacy of the WHA Hall of Fame. When I would go and meet significant players and hockey people, especially from that era, to solicit their participation, I knew more about their careers than they did. They knew I was a guy who really cared about this history and was doing it for the right reason. So many people had picked through the bones of the WHA throughout the 1980s and 1990s, thinking that copyrights were available, that trademarks were available. Let's see if we can make a quick buck by trying to rip off the memory of the league. So by the time that I came around about 10 years ago, people who were involved, especially the players, were so hungry for someone who really did believe in the legacy of what they created there and knew about it. The fact that I watched the league myself, even as a kid. I mean, I was covering the league as a 16-year-old high school journalist. So the fact that I saw it firsthand, I would meet players who I had met, 30 years earlier or 35 years earlier, and explained, you probably don't remember me because I weigh 150 pounds more than I did, and am 6 inches taller than when you met me when I was 14 years old in Indianapolis, Indiana. But I was there. And that made a real difference. And perhaps hockey is a really small family, especially Major League Hockey. Not a lot of people are excellent enough to make it to that level. So your reputation, whether it's good or bad, very quickly is communicated throughout that family. And I was very fortunate that some prominent hockey people believed in what we were doing and spread the word and opened all those doors for me. And it was amazing that I found how many WHA guys were in front offices of current NHL teams. Every NHL team has a high executive who got their start in the WHA. That was fascinating to me. And then, meeting with, for instance, the leadership of the Toronto Hall of Fame. This was a few years ago when Bill Hay was the CEO of the Toronto Hall. Bill Hay is a famous former NHL player with the Chicago Blackhawks.
Sure.
And that's where I knew him from. He was very receptive to what we were doing. And I asked Bill, says, this is really fascinating. You're so connected to the National Hockey League. You're so well known as a player in that league. I'm so thankful that you're so receptive to what we're doing, but do you have some kind of personal connection here? And I didn't even know it. He was a part owner of a WHA team back in the day after he had stopped his career, after he had ended his career. So even he, the president of the Toronto Hall of Fame, had a personal connection to the WHA. He's from Calgary. He was a part owner in the Calgary franchise, and he wanted people to remember that the WHA was the league that brought Major League Hockey to Calgary, Alberta. I thought that was fascinating and was just it's such a great example of how the WHA really still exists in the highest level of Major League Hockey.
So, but what of the league itself, right? The NHL obviously is taken on so many different sort of, much like other sports, right? It's become gigantically large, big business and, expansion and national television and whatever that happened in Las Vegas this year. It's just, I don't think anybody saw coming. It's obviously on a different sort of level. And it's interesting. We've had interesting conversations with various folks. For example, the Whaler guys out of Hartford, right, who still, cling to that sort of wish or that dream that they could get an NHL franchise back, right? But amazing. But it's amazing. It's also you recognize that the Whalers obviously got their start in the WHA, and it's still a very popular logo when it comes to merchandise sales and all that kind of stuff. Still to this day, years and years after the franchise left. So I
20
guess
years later. Yep,
yeah,
20 years later.
What I'm really interested in is sort of how much, and look, there's nobody who's been more passionate and determined than you to sort of keep this WHA thing alive and in the memory and in the collective consciousness. What does the NHL say to you when you either approach them or dialogue with them or people within the various organizations that you communicate with? I mean, do they remember? Do they want to remember? Do they want to forget it? They don't want you to, kind of go away? Or where is the WHA in your mind, in their minds?
Yeah, this is very interesting because one of the things that sets the World Hockey Association apart from other defunct leagues is that former entities from the league still exist now as NHL teams. They made that transition as part of the merger in 1979. And that can complicate this kind of relationship because it isn't like an ABA that doesn't exist anymore and really has been completely absorbed by another league. The Edmonton Oilers and Winnipeg Jets, even though they're the new version of the Winnipeg Jets, are a real reminder about the World Hockey Association. A couple of years ago, for the 45th anniversary of the Edmonton Oilers, that's the 45th anniversary going back to when they started in the WHA in 1972. They put patches on their jerseys, much to the displeasure of the National Hockey League, saying 45 years. And everyone was very confused because the NHL has their merchandise that says Winnipeg Jets, Edmonton Oilers, established 1979. They ignored that the WHA existed. Well, the fans in Winnipeg and Edmonton, also in Hartford and Quebec City, they know that Major League started in 1972 with the WHA. So it's fascinating when you see leagues like the NBA and the NFL, for instance, have both done a great job of taking the history of their former competitors, folding it into their own, and really using it as a really good marketing tool. I mean, both the NBA and the National Football League have had throwback nights, and they'll sell throwback jerseys from their former competitors, former AFL and ABA teams, which I think is fascinating. They've embraced their competitors' former history. The NHL just does not want to do that. And it's interesting. I've asked a lot of people about this for a long time now, for 10 years now. It's not only that the war between the two leagues has been over for so long. They say that the war is over, but now the bodies have been buried for so long, I really don't know what the lingering kind of attitude towards the WHA, why it continues. In talking to people who were very frank about it, associated with the league, they really couldn't quite figure it out because that generation of owners is long gone. It was estimated in 1979 that the WHA had cost the NHL perhaps up to $1 billion in revenue over the time that the two leagues were competing. And that's 1970s dollars, so that's a lot of money back then. and that losing that kind of money can create some lasting ill thoughts. But that generation of owners and all, both in the league and in the teams, they're long gone. I'm not quite sure why there's still in some quarters animosity towards the World Hockey Association, except the WHA was revolutionary. The WHA struck down the reserve clause and brought on free agency in hockey. It revolutionized hockey, which never would have happened if it was just left to the NHL. So it could be something as simple as that. The economics of the game were changed forever by the WHA.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about that. And, you'd think that the NHL would feel largely comfortable with its amazing recent financial success. Yeah, a few franchises are a little questionable, but I mean, when you got Las Vegas or maybe Seattle ponying up almost $500 million to be sort of next in line as an expansion franchise, right? Things are probably considered to be pretty rosy. And you wonder where that potential, what risk there would be to at least tip, the cap towards some level of history. You mentioned earlier, and we've had a couple of conversations with some actual former graphic designers who were part of creating logos for various teams and leagues, not in hockey yet. I don't think we've discussed, but what happens to those logos and stuff? I mean, they, a lot of them have fallen into public domain, and you sort of referenced before, there are certainly folks out there that kind of just rush right in and try to make logo wear and that kind of stuff kind of on the cheap. And, you wonder how the people who created those original logos and maybe some of the those assets could, get a little bit of love for that work that they did 30, 40 years ago. You'd think an NHL, like the NBA has done, like Major League Baseball has done with the Negro Leagues, like you mentioned some of the stuff with the NFL, right? That to own and, if you will, operate those logos in many respects could arguably be considered a more professional caretaking approach to actually preserve that history in a more professional way.
Yeah, I've had that discussion, and in 2009 or 2010, we had a screening of my documentary about the Indianapolis Racers and the start of Wayne Gretzky as a major leaguer, as an Indianapolis Racer and then an Edmonton Oiler. And we went around the museum displays because we had a lot of WHA players with us, and they were excited to see what was in the actual museum. And we noticed a couple things very quickly. There was a display for Gordie Howe and a display for Bobby Hull, of course, both big stars in the World Hockey Association, except in their display from 1972 to 1979, they had no statistics. They just weren't there. And then we went around and looked at Mark Messier and Wayne Gretzky's induction plaque into the Hall of Fame there. And the number of years that they played Major League Hockey was off by the number of years that they played in the WHA. They didn't exist. And then we went and saw, there's got to be a WHA display here somewhere. And we found the WHA in a display which was titled Defunct Minor Leagues. And the look on the WHA players' faces when they saw that and how they were being treated by that Hall of Fame, I will never forget. So that should tell you, in about 10 or 15 minutes there, we learned everything we needed to know about what that league thinks about the history of the WHA. This is why, for the last 10 years, we've gone out of our way and worked very, very hard to make sure that the actual history of the World Hockey Association is preserved and protected and will be shared with generations to come.
All right. It's in a minute, I want to go back to sort of the original sort of seeds of your interest and your growing up as a fan in Indianapolis. But before we do that, I want to get into some of the things that you're alluding to, this film that you have and what looks to be a relatively recent spurt of media, both in printed and in I guess an ongoing video form. Maybe you can regale our audience into what a little bit of background as to sort of what I think is a sort of a robust library of stuff that is relatively new in the marketplace, and we'll tout it later on the show and how to find it and get it and purchase it and all that kind of stuff. But maybe you can allude to the films that you've done, or the Racers film in particular, as well as what I saw just recently, what I thought was just a masterful idea, the idea to sort of go back into the old media guides and game day programs and literally mine those for, the content that, has not been digitized, not been resold, frankly, hasn't probably been seen in, since the league itself was running.
Yeah, so I'm a media guy. I own my own media company. We do film and video and audio. I'm a journalist. I do sports broadcasting. I work for hockey teams. And I love hockey and now have all this access to the WHA Hall of Fame. So it makes sense that I know how actually to put this stuff together and make it available for people to have. The proceeds go back in so that we can have another event or fund another documentary. So over the past few years, I've been able to write, produce, and direct a number of original exclusive documentaries about the World Hockey Association. We have a 3 DVD set out. They're 2 DVDs each. We have a Blu-ray that's the best of that stuff, plus new productions and things that aren't on the DVDs, plus the first ever high-definition film transfer of WHA footage. We found original WHA film and had it transferred to HD. So, that was natural for me because I operate a video production company and I can do all that stuff and have access to the stuff that's needed. And, I know how to negotiate rights and licenses and acquire stuff and all that kind of stuff. But also there's stuff that needs to be documented in print. One of the purposes of the WHA Hall of Fame is to correct a lot of repeated history that's just been incorrect about the league. Because there hasn't been a lot of reputable sources about the league. A lot of stories that have been reported earlier just keep getting regurgitated. And we kept seeing this in books, even recent books, of stuff that just isn't factually true. So, as a lifelong journalist who loves to be factually accurate, we also have published books, and we have a hardcover book that's kind of a coffee table book that's a photo book based on our archives of unreleased photographs, hockey photographs from the WHA, and that's a hardcover book. We have a book that I authored that's a personal history of the Indianapolis Racers, and that's very much the story of a teenager getting sucked into Major League Hockey in this exciting, wacky WHA and seeing people like Pat Stapleton and Mark Messier and Wayne Gretzky in Indianapolis. And then we have a book about the Winnipeg Jets. I just signed a deal with a noted Texas historian who's writing a book about the WHA Houston Aeros, which of course is famous for having Gordie Howe and his 2 sons play, and they won a couple of the WHA championships. So we have a series of books. We have a series of videos. We've done some WHA Hall of Fame hockey cards for some of the players that have been inducted into the WHA Hall of Fame, some of them who never had a hockey card before. So we wanted to make sure they could finally have a hockey card. And I thought that was interesting. We restored hours and hours and hours of audio and radio broadcasts. Some of this stuff we haven't even been able to make available yet. But just today, we started our streaming video service. I have so much stuff and so many productions in our video library. A lot of people don't use DVDs or Blu-ray discs anymore, and they want to be able to look at stuff in clips a la carte. Well, I don't want 5 hours of that. I want that 30-minute section that's about the Cincinnati Stingers. Well, now we're getting that up online, so people can go, through WHAHOF.com. That's our main Hall of Fame website. And they can go and see streaming video and look at that a la carte. So we're trying to keep up with the times and deliver stuff in a way that especially young people who never had a chance to see the WHA can experience this interesting, alternate universe.
So we are breaking some news on this podcast. We always love to do that. Brand new content coming from the WHA Hall of Fame.
And this will be news for several months because we're going to unleash each Monday a new feature-length bit of clips and stuff. So today, our first feature went up. Next Monday, and for the next 3 or 4 months, each week there'll be another selection of WHA stuff, and it'll all stay up there. The other stuff isn't going to disappear, but it's going to take us months to get it all up there, and then we're working on some new productions that will follow after that. So we're very excited about that, because the whole idea here is to make this stuff available so people can see it. I mean, you referred to our book about the media guides, and we haven't done a lot of reprint stuff of original materials from the WHA, but this was something that fans and researchers and journalists had asked me for a long time about. In our collection, we have most of the media guides, the yearly guides that teams would put together to give to the media, but the league each year also made its own guide. And for those 7 years, we took all 7 years of those media guides. This was 800 pages total. And it's the kind of thing that if I would have known how massive a job this was going to be to reproduce these things, as with most of these huge projects, I wouldn't, once you're in the middle of it, you got to keep going. It's good just not to think about how big of a project that you've taken on. But this was 800 pages that we had to scan and clean up, had to replace a lot of photos that were poor quality with better versions of that exact same photo, and just do a lot of cleanup and stuff so that it was an archived version of this for history, but also that could be printed in its original size, all 800 pages as one volume that you can just have on the shelf and have that really handy encyclopedia about the World Hockey Association. So yeah, that just came out a couple of weeks ago.
I think that's brilliant. And frankly, I know that there are other folks out there who are more passionate about, say, other sports like pro soccer or the ABA or, the AFL, who would love to kind of see the same thing done for those leagues as well. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of jealousy, I think, in terms of you and the WHA. I think that a lot of people would love to perhaps knock on your door for your services. I don't know if you wholesale them, but whatever. I think it's an essential look, especially in the era of digitization and all that kind of stuff. Right? It does get lost. These things do get lost in translation, and you keep seeing. Yeah. People having recollections, or they'll scan a page or something and they'll put that on a Twitter feed, and it's brand new pieces of information. They literally, it's locked into printed pages, and you're at least helping sort of unleash those a little bit so that they can be shared and understood and read and consumed by newer generations who don't even know what, frankly, a library is, sadly. If it's even...
Well, that is absolutely right. And to have them all together, because I talked to so many fans who said, yeah, I was able to find 1973, but no one ever has 1978. It's so expensive to get. So for the price of less than trying to find one of the vintage things, you get the entire collection. It's just a really, really handy thing, and it's especially for hockey fans. If you like vintage hockey, there's something special about having statistics. And all the information, all the league information. I mean, these things weren't given to fans back in the days. These were given to journalists and guys in the front office of hockey teams in the league. So it's this inside peek at a major hockey league that's fascinating. And you follow players from one team to another. And you see Glenn Sather, who went on to win the Stanley Cup in the 80s as a player in the WHA, and then his first coaching job in the WHA, and then suddenly he's winning Stanley Cups in the 80s. So for fans of hockey history, to see the Wayne Gretzky rookie photo in there in the WHA media guide, and the only statistics they have for him is for his junior year, the year before when he was 16. It's fascinating,
All right, time for me to catch my breath, get a cool, tasty beverage, and remind you, while we do so, that our friends at Audible are here to remind you that you can get a free audiobook download of your choice from over 180,000 titles. If you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and use that link, of course, to try for yourself a free audiobook on us, gratis, if you will. And you will love the idea of audiobooks. It's an awesome way to kill time and occupy and stimulate your mind, perhaps when your eyes are busy doing something else. And of course, there are plenty of interesting books to be found, especially in the world of sports and sports history. And I think our audience might enjoy a few of these, of course, including the seminal work by baseball legend Jim Bouton. It's called Ball 4. It is not only written, but it's also narrated by him. You could use your free credit for that book. And of course, as you know, Ball 4 centers around the 1969 one-year wonder that is the Seattle Pilots of Major League Baseball, but obviously the background for a whole lot of other observations about the sport of baseball. And it remains to this day perhaps one of the most celebrated writings about the sport of baseball in this country. Of course, you can also, if you're not a big baseball fan, you can go into the world of soccer with the autobiography called My Turn by Johan Cruyff, the late Johan Cruyff, perhaps one of the world's best ever soccer players. He of Dutch heritage, of course. Plenty of great legendary years at club play as well as national team play for the Dutch team, as well as, for our audience, maybe a little bit of interest, his journeys in the North American Soccer League in the late 70s and early 80s with the Washington Diplomats and the Los Angeles Aztecs. And of course, if you're into football, there's probably no better book, especially if you find yourself really interested in the sort of deep and rich history of the NFL, with the book called NFL Football, A History of America's New National Pastime. It is written by Richard Crepeau and narrated by Marlon May. That, too, is an audiobook that you could choose from over, like I said, 180,000 titles. There's got to be something in there that's going to be of interest to you. And by all means, give it a try. And we appreciate your doing so at audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you're going to get your free audiobook download. You can cancel it anytime. And again, even if you cancel it, you can keep that book as long as your device exists. So again, we appreciate it. Give it a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. So before we get off this little subtopic here, where are you finding all this stuff? How do you find it? How does it find you? And is there more stuff yet to be discovered? I think I know the answer to that.
Yeah, I tell people, I have stuff related to the league that there was only one of them that was in the league office and someone has donated to me. We have a lot of stuff like that. And I explain that this is as with the footage that we've found, we own a lot of exclusive footage and video that the rights were still retained to. They were not public domain things. And we own all that stuff now, and it's first generation broadcast stuff. There was so little of that existed before we found it. And I say it's very much like an Indiana Jones expedition, where you have to go through layers and layers and layers of stuff, with collectors, with museums, with fans, with players. We've been helped a lot with people who at one time or another were involved in ownership of teams in the league, and they kept stuff. And a lot of these people had been holding this stuff until there was someone they could trust that it was going to be not used for personal gain. It was going to be used to preserve the history of the league. So we're, very gratified that a lot of people have trusted us with their collections of things, and people associated with the league had heard stories of giving these kinds of items to other historical institutions, and they were gathering them just to put them in the basement so that they wouldn't be on display. I mean, there was a concerted effort not to show the history of the WHA, and which really concerned a lot of people. And we promised, of course, we would never do that. So we're happy that we've been able to save a lot of stuff from kind of getting put away in the corner basements of some museums because they didn't want people to see it.
So is there anything that's sort of on your holy grail list that remains elusive that you wonder or seeking out that you have yet to find or wonder where something like it might be?
Yeah, and this is a classic WHA story. For the second through the seventh year of the league was around from 1972 to 1979. For the last 6 years, they had a really unique championship trophy, which was donated, built by the Avco Financial Services. It no longer exists, but in the 1970s, it was a big insurance company. And it was a very big insurance company, and they were into film production and all kinds of things. And one of their promotional efforts, they paid for this incredibly cool championship trophy, the WHA's version of the Stanley Cup. and it had a globe, a three-dimensional globe inside a lucite, clear plastic cylinder that you could see, very futuristic looking with a silver cup on top of it. Now that's in the Manitoba Sports Hall of Fame in Winnipeg. The Winnipeg Jets were the last team to win the WHA trophy, so it stayed in Winnipeg when the two leagues merged. And it's on display now in the Winnipeg Manitoba Sports Hall of Fame. When we have events there, they let us use it. They have a wonderful Winnipeg Jets collection at the Manitoba Sports Hall of Fame. However, in the first year of the league, that trophy wasn't done yet. It was such a technological achievement to get this globe and this lucite thing and this very modern trophy for the time. It wasn't done. So the New England Whalers figured, well, do you know what? I think we're going to win the championship here tonight, and we don't have a trophy. And they ran out to a local trophy shop and just got the coolest looking cup that they could find so that there was something to present to the team that night. And we can't find that trophy. And we're still looking for it. And the Howard Baldwin, the former owner of the team, thinks he knows where it might be. We can't find it. Some people say that it's in a museum in Nova Scotia. Nope, that's not it. It's not in the Hall of Fame in Toronto. That's the Holy Grail. We want to find that makeshift temporary championship trophy.
Well, Howard Baldwin is on our wish list, and we, I think, are going to be able to talk to Dennis Murphy in a couple of weeks. So perhaps a couple of inquiries possibly could be found on that. But there it is to our listeners, if you're listening. And frankly, Tim, you'll be surprised at the various nooks and crannies that this show reaches into. If anybody has any insight on the New England Whalers,
I am not surprised. I am not surprised at what comes out of some of these queries. Sometimes we won't have a fact that we need to know, and I'll put that question out on our Facebook pages. We have several WHA Hall of Fame Facebook pages that you can go and just do a search for World Hockey Association Hall of Fame on Facebook, and you'll find us. One about goaltenders, one about the whole league. And sometimes I just turn to the public. Does anybody know who this is in this photo? We can't identify them. And someone always comes up with it. It's amazing, the information, once you put that question out into the universe, what you can find. So while I think that this trophy is somewhere in a storeroom and just needs to be discovered, I wouldn't be surprised if someone calls me up and says, Tim, I've had that in my den for the last 35 years. Yeah, I'm sure. And I guess that sort of serendipity, I guess, is always sort of looming out there, right? There's probably always going to be something or somebody who's going to find or remember, or that they've got something that you've been sort of looking to sort of complete the collection and the archives. So I think I was glancing at a couple of the pages of your book on the Indianapolis Racers, which is called Positive Waves, the history of the Indianapolis Racers. And I think it's sort of the quintessential intro or description of how somebody like you in your early teenage years could get so hooked on a team, this franchise, a league. Maybe you can kind of just dial back the Wayback Machine a little and sort of give a taste of, because I really want to communicate this passion, right? Because it's obviously that you've gone beyond, like I said before, the call of duty for this kind of stuff. But maybe you can sort of give our audience a sense of what it was like, your first game. Why were you there in the first place? What appealed to you? The whole experience. What was it that sort of, kind of lit your fire, so to speak, and that, arguably is not even close to being squelched? So if I remember right, it was, so Indianapolis was an expansion team. It started in the third year of the league. And I believe I missed the first 7 games of the franchise's history, which sounds like, well, you didn't lose a lot, but, we lost the team at the end of the WHA, and I would do anything right now if I could see 7 more games of Indianapolis Racers hockey. I know that sounds a little silly, but as a 13-year-old, it literally was the first major league sporting event I had ever been to in Indianapolis. Indianapolis is a wonderful Midwest city, and they support sports teams more like it's a college sports team in Indianapolis. There's that community feel behind it. It's not cynical at all. It's very much, wow, this team is representing Indianapolis. So the feel in the buildings for basketball and football and hockey in Indianapolis is much more like a collegiate kind of situation. And that really infected me. The Indianapolis really embraced this team. And it was just so, to a 13-year-old, just so colorful. Half the guys spoke French. They all had white guy afros. They wore fur coats and disco shoes. They would play and have chains on. Very few players were wearing helmets, so you got to see their expressions and their personality on the ice. And this was in contrast to the National Hockey League, who at that time, teams were still forcing players to wear matching suits and have crew cuts, and you don't say anything you're not supposed to say, and you're not supposed to have your own personality. In order to compete and attract players from that other league, the WHA were a players' league. The coach is there to help you, not to yell at you. It was very much the transition in society from the 60s to the 70s, and that was very exciting to me. So I got to see a player like Pat Stapleton, for instance, who in the 1960s was a big star with the Chicago Blackhawks of the NHL, and you see the photos of him with his flat-top haircut and wearing his Chicago Blackhawks plaid jacket and doing what he's supposed to do. He signed and came over to the WHA, and suddenly he had this long, blonde Dutch boy Beatles haircut, and he's wearing bell-bottoms and giving press conferences that were just incredibly entertaining. And he said he was able to suddenly be himself. And that was a whole generation of players. And this was an era where, as a kid, we could go to the locker room and wait there, and every single guy would stop and talk to us like we were human beings, like we were people. And that's going to get you excited about your team and start to live and die, literally, with what your team was doing. In many ways, it helped me get into my media career. I do hockey radio now, and that's because of the hockey radio guy for the Indianapolis Racers. He's now a Hall of Fame guy who's still with the Indianapolis Colts of the NFL. He went on to be the voice of the Pacers, the ABA, and then the NBA Pacers. He's still in Indianapolis as the radio voice of the Indianapolis Colts team. Well, he started as the voice of the WHA Indianapolis Racers, and it's one of the reasons why I'm in broadcasting today. So it was just so important in my formative years to have that positive experience with, and this is why the book is called Positive Waves. It became the slogan for the team that, we're not the best players. We're the collection of players that other teams didn't want. We're an expansion franchise, and nothing's going to stop us. There was this positive feeling around it, and they called it Positive Waves.
And the sister website to the WHA Hall of Fame site that we mentioned earlier, which is the deepest repository on the planet devoted to the Indianapolis Racers, is WHARacers.com, WHARacers.com. And I get the sense that this was kind of the first part of your exploits, and then that sort of branched out into the grander WHA league itself.
Absolutely right. When I started this journey in about 2007, it was because it was the personal story that I knew the best. I started with the Racers. Now, luckily, the Indianapolis Racers had the most famous hockey player in the history of the sport, Wayne Gretzky, begin his career in Indianapolis. So that was the hook that anyone who's interested in hockey history wants to hear that story. Like, I try to explain it to people, like, what if you knew that Babe Ruth played one more year of Major League Hockey in a league you've never heard of before? Would you be interested to hear that story? And that's very much the Wayne Gretzky story in that last year of the World Hockey Association. So we started with the Indianapolis Racers, with that website, and with that book, and suddenly people came out of the woodwork. Hey, we've got video. Says, Tim, you probably don't know this. I shot the very first film of Wayne Gretzky as a major leaguer. Would you like the Super 8 footage? And suddenly it turned into the beginnings of a media archive. Then we were able to sell enough books to be able to go and buy some footage. and then sell enough DVDs that we could make another documentary. And then that turned into, in about 2009, the WHA Hall of Fame.
So for every Indianapolis Racers, right, which is arguably one of the better supported, and you mentioned the fact that Indianapolis, I mean, obviously with the Pacers as well, right? You know, what a town for, you know, professional sports, right, which had largely been overlooked. That the city and the region was certainly growing. It was certainly the time and the place where pro teams, especially in the two major winter sports, could have a shot and be, you know, received and followed, you know, in a, you said it before, more college-like and more passionate kind of way. But for every one of those teams, right, there seems to have been 2 or 3 teams that were, I don't know, shall we say wayward, haphazard, or just all and out, woeful, either on the ice or off the ice or both. Any teams in this litany of failed franchises, I guess, in the WHA's history that stand out in your mind as either being, you know, interesting or especially notable or ridiculously unique in their ways, or is it just sort of one big melting pot of craziness and wackiness in your mind?
No, you're absolutely right. There were, I always get this number wrong because some of these franchises came and go or turned into each other. I think it was 26 teams that eventually were on the ice at one time or another. Not at the same time. The largest number was, I think, 16 at any number of time. But it fluctuated year by year. They started with 12 teams in the first year. And then the middle years of the league were the most stable, and they were about 14 or 16 teams every year. And then when they merged, there were only 7 teams left. So there were real ups and downs, and teams were coming and going. So for every Winnipeg Jets and Edmonton Oilers and New England Whalers and Indianapolis Racers, you have some just completely underfunded franchises. And the WHA, this is the fascinating thing about a league like this, they would allow owners who had like $20,000. Well, that's enough to get started. Okay, you can take over that team. So a team that comes to mind especially was the Jersey Knights. So this is the first major league team in the state of New Jersey. The WHA thought, in order to survive, we have to compete in Madison Square Garden in New York City. We need a team in New York City. So they started in the first year with the team in New York City, the New York Raiders. They ran out of money after a year, and so they became the New York Golden Knights, who famously wore white hockey skates. They ran out of money halfway through that season, so they moved the team to Cherry Hill, New Jersey. This rink was so old, I think it was from the 1930s, and the ice was wavy. So if you shot the puck down the ice, it would skip on the goaltender. Also, it wasn't real. They didn't have a lot of light in the corners, so you had to be careful you went into the corners of the rink because you couldn't see exactly what was in there. The players, there were no dressing rooms, so players had to get dressed on the bus and then walk through the crowd to the benches. But, you know, the benches were just part of the stands, so players could come and fans could come and mess with the players. So when you had an atmosphere like that and a team like that, this made people doubt, gee, can this league survive? What the heck is going on? Then you go to Indianapolis, you have a brand new 17,000 seat arena that at that point was probably one of the best hockey arenas in North America. And for media members, this was very confusing. There were legitimate franchises, and then some that looked a lot like Slapshot. And now we can laugh about it, and that's what makes the league so fascinating, how it could survive 7 years, have so many good players in it, and still have some of these incredibly ridiculous stories.
Well, it's especially interesting. You mentioned the Jersey Knights, which I think is an interesting story in and of itself. They only lasted a season from 73 to 74. But I think people also forget the fact that the Philadelphia Blazers actually, right, in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, in Philadelphia, were in Philadelphia the year before, right? So in some respects, what Philadelphia, for whatever reason, and I'm not a Blazers expert, right? I just play one on TV. But, at least there was some WHA experience within the Philadelphia metro area that possibly could have given the Jersey Knights a shot. But I think the really interesting point of that entire story, right? You mentioned the Raiders and the Golden Blades and then the Jersey Knights. And then they, of course, completely absconded in 74 to go to San Diego, right? So they couldn't deal with it that much longer to be on the East Coast. That all got into motion, if I'm not mistaken, because originally Messrs. Davidson and Murphy had designs on getting an inaugural franchise in the brand new Nassau Coliseum, and the NHL
absolutely right.
And the NHL cut them off at the pass before they could even get
the only reason why the New York Islanders exist is because the WHA started in 1972, and they were going to put the New York Raiders in Nassau Coliseum. Now, if the New York Raiders go in Nassau Coliseum, the WHA absolutely survives in the New York area, and would have been a huge problem for the NHL. It would have been very, very successful. That's the reason why the New York Islanders exist. They beat them to it and put them in that arena so that the WHA couldn't do it. And it's the same reason why, they put a franchise in Kansas City, they put a franchise in Washington, D.C. They were trying to stay one step ahead of places that were going to have a new building that the WHA would go into.
All right. Besides Indianapolis, what other team would you sort of call yourself a fan of, based on all the stuff that you've learned over the years and discovered as you've built up this Hall of Fame and all these other sort of supplemental media remembrances?
Well, I'm very proud that I spent a lot of time in Canada, and fans of the Winnipeg Jets have nominated me to be an honorary Canadian. And this makes me very proud. I love Canadian culture. I love the game of hockey. I love Winnipeg, Manitoba. For a teenage kid from Indianapolis to become an aficionado and expert on the Winnipeg Jets of the 1970s might be as interesting a story as the WHA story. But I have incredible respect for what the Winnipeg Jets of the 1970s did before the merger with the NHL. They won the league championship 3 times. They were the first to bring over major European talent to Canada. And one of the great pleasures that I've had in this past 10 years is getting to know my absolutely favorite players from that era of the Winnipeg Jets, Anders Hedberg and Ulf Nilsson from Sweden. We were able to get them to come back and have a reunion in Winnipeg with Bobby Hull to induct them into the WHA Hall of Fame. And as a kid, I had not had a chance to meet them or talk to them. And as an adult, I found that these people were as much the heroes as I thought they were when I was a kid watching them play. They were just such wonderful, wonderful people. The hockey fans of Winnipeg, Manitoba, I don't know if anyone has the kind of passion and love for their Winnipeg Jets. And part of that is because, it's a smaller place, it's on the plains and doesn't get the attention that Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal gets. And as a matter of fact, in Canada, there's a lot of people like to make fun of Winnipeg. It's the middle of nowhere. Who cares about Winnipeg? And it's a smaller community that just loves their Jets. And they see no difference. You see, this is an interesting thing that's difficult for I think, the NHL league offices to understand, that in places like Edmonton and Winnipeg, they see no difference between the WHA versions of their team and the NHL versions of their team. They were both major league, and they're both incredibly important. They have incredible pride about them starting in 1972 in the WHA. They see no difference. So when we had our event there, this is for a team in a league that went away in 1979. It was the first reunion since 1978 of these players there. And we were on the front page of the newspaper as the news event of the day. And we had our event, and it was swamped with thousands of people. It was insane. And they loved those guys. And this was one of the greatest, personal kind of payments that I got for doing this, was to get that together for those people and for those players, some who hadn't seen each other for 35 years, and to see that kind of emotion and love and the idea that they knew they had been remembered and that history wasn't going to go away. I think that might be one of my greatest accomplishments.
All right. So as we round the corner here, let me ask you a question maybe directly related to that, right? So, and this does sort of get into the realm of, history and where the official sort of tracing of lineage occurs, right? So you talk about the Winnipeg Jets of the WHA. They came into the NHL and then, of course, moved to Phoenix and now are known as the Arizona Coyotes, right? And then the Atlanta Thrashers, right, after having a decade or so of, I don't know, moribundness, if that's a word, then relocating themselves to Winnipeg and I guess inheriting that legacy from the old team, or does that reside with Arizona? Or so what is the answer to that, number one? Where is that Winnipeg WHA history? Is it both teams?
Yeah, this is so weird. This is so weird because when the franchise moved up the road from me, a couple hours north of me to Phoenix as the Phoenix Coyotes, and now a few years ago they changed it to the Arizona Coyotes, when it was moved from Winnipeg, they officially took ownership of all the NHL Jets history and statistics. And that's why, even though Bobby Hull did play a few games in the NHL Jets in that very first year, just a couple though. They have Bobby Hull's jersey retired in the rafters of the arena in Phoenix, even though he never played for the Coyotes. He played a few games in the first year of the NHL Jets. And the Coyotes own all of their statistics and everything. And they've retired the numbers of a couple of the NHL players. This makes no sense to the fans in Phoenix because they never played there. Those people would rather be inducted as part of the new Winnipeg Jets. So when the new Winnipeg Jets formed, and luckily that's with local ownership in Manitoba, so this is a real Winnipeg team. They negotiated to get the Jets name back. It was kind of like the Cleveland Browns coming back to Cleveland. There's no way that team was going to be called anything other than the Winnipeg Jets. And so they got permission to use the name, and they really can't celebrate the previous incarnation of the team's NHL history, but they have embraced the history, the WHA history of the Jets. Because like I said to the people of Winnipeg, they see no difference. They're still the Jets. And if you scan around on TV and watch a current Winnipeg Jets game in the NHL, you'll see thousands of WHA Winnipeg Jets jerseys in the arena. People really, that was the high point of Major League Hockey in the 1970s in Winnipeg. They did nothing as an NHL franchise, in the playoffs. They won championships in the WHA. So that's a very weird kind of arrangement there. I think when the team moved to Phoenix, they never really anticipated that the NHL would allow another franchise to go back into Winnipeg. But we are all very, very happy that the Winnipeg Jets are back where they belong.
So, in other words, the WHA part of the Winnipeg Jets history, whether it's number one or number two, the subsequent, right? Are you saying that the WHA version of that history either doesn't have an official home or has been adopted by either officially or unofficially by the new current team in Winnipeg?
Oh, the new current team doesn't ignore it, and as a matter of fact, they've had WHA Jets nights there. They've had the players back. They've honored them. They've had events. They had at one of the outdoor games that they had in Winnipeg 2 years ago, they wore their WHA jerseys for that NHL outdoor game. So the current franchise has done a good job. They've called me and had me be an advisor to them about that history when they did that outdoor event to make sure that the jerseys were correct and that they had some of the data and how to find some of the players and this and that. So they've embraced their WHA history, the current ownership of the Winnipeg Jets. All right.
We didn't. Okay. One last thing, and then we'll sort of let you get into some promotional stuff here. So, it's also very interesting, and I don't know how much you've gotten into this, but this part is always fascinating. The more asterisk-driven or laden sports history is, the more interested I am in it. But the WHA, perhaps more than any other defunct league that we've explored thus far, seems to have perhaps more franchises that were named and never actually played a game than any other league that I know. I mean, the Calgary Broncos, the Los Angeles Aces, the Miami Screaming Eagles, which was part of Dennis Murphy's original plan as a co-founder of the league, the San Francisco Sharks. I mean, do any of this stuff exist? I mean, I guess most of it's probably prototype, right? But I got to think that there might have been, as part of your collection or your remembrances, or maybe part of your Holy Grail list, either concepts of uniforms or logo designs or, plans that never sort of got any of that stuff sort of in the mix, or is that kind of elusive or non-existent?
We have a little bit of it, but that's of less interest to me because literally in 1970 and 1971, the original creators of the league, a lot of the stuff was really just floated out as PR material. There was never going to be a Miami Screaming Eagles. There was never going to be a Dayton Arrows. These teams were never going to actually exist. They were being floated to try to attract investors into the teams that they really wanted. They did want to put a team in Calgary, so that Calgary Broncos was an idea that they wanted, but there was no ownership or money or any actual teams when they announced any of these names or places. And later they would end up in Calgary. So that was one that they wanted. I mean, they toyed with the idea of San Francisco. They toyed with the idea of some of these places, but these were not legitimate. I mean, so I've seen someone a few years ago came out with a series of pucks for the Miami Screaming Eagles and the Dayton Arrows and some other things, and it's just ridiculous. Those teams never actually existed. So that's of less interest to me because there are enough defunct teams in the WHA that actually took the ice. It's one of these things that we try to center our attention on, teams that at least played a game.
That's very interesting. It's a very interesting perspective. I will bookmark that one for my conversation, hopefully with Dennis Murphy, because it does seem pretty logical that that it was sort of an effort to perhaps convey a bit more comprehensiveness, I guess, when you're announcing the league, to have those teams and maybe use that as leverage, even though it wasn't necessarily fully guaranteed yet. That's a pretty interesting concept and thought. I never really kind of thought about that as a lever.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if Dennis denies all that. He's a great promoter, and let's face it, you had to be a great promoter to get this league off the ground. But I think when they had their first press release and they had a makeshift logo that looked a lot like the Man from U.N.C.L.E. logo, it was only used at this first press conference, and it's not a great logo, but they needed something, so they made one up for the press conference, and that's a lot what everything they said in the press conference was made up. I think they only had 4 teams at that time, 4 real teams with 4 real owners and 4 real places to play, and they just made up the rest because no one was it was getting along in their plans, and for the press to take them seriously, they had to say they had 12 teams, and here's where they are. And to everyone's amazement, they really did start with 12 teams, but in lots of different places than they announced, in the year earlier. And again, this is not to denigrate the people who made this league possible. They did what they had to do against incredible odds to get this league to play even one game. No one gave them even a 1% chance that they were going to drop the puck and have even one game. And then after the first month, they said they won't survive for a second month. And then, they won't survive to the halfway mark. They won't survive the first season. And year after year, they kept pulling the rabbit out of their hat and started to attract fans, millions and millions of fans, and started to do really well at the gate. So, they did what they had to do to get that league off the ground. And throughout the league's history, a lot of it was just not telling the truth about how much money they had or how much money an owner had or what the actual economic status of some of these teams, because a lot of teams, like in Indianapolis, were living paycheck to paycheck, but somehow managed to keep going.
All right, so let's take a couple of minutes here for you to go through some of the promotional fodder here. Give us the websites, give us the various media that you've got out there, and what else you got in the hopper that might be coming down the pike.
Yeah, this has been a busy spring and summer for us. It's interesting, here in Tucson when it's the off season, we actually get a lot done for the WHA Hall of Fame. It's really interesting because during the season I'm doing hockey stuff, but when it's 110 degrees out, I tend to get a lot done for the Hockey Hall of Fame, and that's why we have 2 new books out. Head over to WHAHOF.com. That's our main website, and you'll see there we have a new book of a collection of stories from WHA game programs. And this is a fascinating way to tell the history of the league through the eyes of feature articles about players and teams. We have the new book about the media guys. We have a Winnipeg Jets book and the book about the Racers. That coffee table book that I mentioned before, the photo book. We have a Blu-ray and DVDs that are available through Amazon. All the links are there at WHAHOF.com. We just launched the streaming video. Head over to Facebook and find the WHA Hall of Fame page there. So we'll have a couple new books coming up in this next year and some more video productions. I'm trying to think what I've forgotten, because we've also been involved as a technical advisor in some films. And there's some WHA more dramatic films that are in the planning stages that we hope to be involved with. There was a dramatic film about Gordie Howe and the Houston Aeros playing with his sons that was completed a couple of years ago, and we were the technical director on that. So there's a couple other WHA-related dramatic films that are going to be coming up that we hope to be involved in. We're going to release more game audio in this next year. It's, to the point now here to celebrate our 10th year, we're going to put a lot of free stuff out on the web for hockey fans. It's to the point now where this kind of reminds me of Dick Clark late in his life. He had so much exclusive 1960s rock and roll stuff that he just wouldn't let anyone see. He figured that it would get more and more and more valuable until it was so long from the 1960s that people started to forget those bands and not have nearly as much interest in them. And we're getting pretty far along from the WHA era here, and players are getting older. And if I was just a kid when the WHA is around and now I'm in my 50s, it's time to get as much of this stuff out into the hands of fans so they can relive and know this history. So I think as part of our 10-year anniversary in this next year, I think there's going to be a lot of media that's going to come out of the WHA Hall of Fame, including our streaming video. Week after week, we're going to release, hours of production that you can stream through our streaming video service.
Well, I think it's great. I mean, part of the reason why we do this little show, besides folks like yourselves who have devoted so much time and passion and energy to preserving things like the WHA and the various teams that were part of it, we also try to endeavor to do quite a lot of first-person stuff, right? As people get older and, because it's sort of a bit of an oral history, right? Because in some respects, some of these things are just going to be lost to time. And, there's so many great stories. And frankly, it's not just history for its own sake, but it's also the roots of what exists today. I mean, how many of the teams, in the diaspora of the NHL, owe either direct or indirect lineages to what got started in the 70s with the WHA. So you're to be commended for all this hard work, because I don't think it's in vain by any stretch of the imagination, because not only is it fun, I'm sure, and it obviously reminds you of your childhood and the halcyon days of that, right? That's a feel good, right? But it's also it's preserving stuff that, look at the NHL. It's a monstrosity of a professional league. And, to remember when it wasn't so robust, and frankly, how a bunch of teams and initiatives and innovations came about in this league was because of either indirect or direct evidence and experiences of the WHA.
Well, I agree. I mean, I say that what I love is when kids in their 20s who are hockey fans discover this and realize it's an alternate universe with these incredibly colorful uniforms and logos. And when they see the footage and how these guys were and the personalities, they get so excited about that. Gets me so excited. And, and I explained to them, like a Columbus Blue Jacket fans, well, you have Major League Hockey here because the WHA had a team in Cincinnati and in Cleveland. The owners of the Blue Jackets know that. That's why their mascot is actually named after the Cincinnati Stingers. His name is Stinger of the WHA, a little tip of the hat to, in the 70s, Major League Hockey in Ohio. And there are so many cities now in North America that have Major League Hockey because the WHA, were the trailblazers there. Denver, Ontario, Ottawa, Calgary, Phoenix, all of these places had WHA teams first, and that's a history that is worth remembering and embracing.
Well, Tim, this has been awesome. I appreciate it. I'm glad we finally got a chance to connect and talk, and frankly, just scratch the surface of all that, all the wonderfulness and wackiness that has and was and maybe still is the World Hockey Association. I thank you tremendously, and I know our audience is probably going to be ravenous for this stuff as well, and hopefully we'll get a few new visitors and perhaps purchasers of your stuff. Obviously, we'll have links to all of your media stuff from our website when we post this episode, and I look forward to hopefully staying in touch, and I hope you'll keep us in the loop when new events or new items or new projects sort of come out, because you certainly have a forum here to tout those if and when you're ready to do so. We'd love to have you.
Tim, thank you so much for having me on, and please have me back. I'll tell you more crazy stories about the wild and woolly WHA, because after all, this is supposed to be fun. Hockey is supposed to be fun, and that's perhaps one of the biggest reasons why we continue 10 years on now with the WHA Hall of Fame.
Well, there you go. Passion, thy name is Tim Gassen. Thank you very much for that intriguing chat. And let's see, there's a whole host of places that you need to write down and go to, including WHAHOF. That's World Hockey Association Hall of Fame.com. That's the place with all the sort of consolidated WHA stuff that Tim has put together, and points to all the various media that we talked about, the books, the DVDs, the online video streaming that's just launching. The sister site and the originator site, I guess, is the one devoted to the Indianapolis Racers. We talked about that. That's at WHARacers.com. And of course, you can follow Tim and his doings with the WHA Hall of Fame at WHAHOF. That's the Twitter handle there. And of course, we will have all kinds of links and further descriptive stuff on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with Tim Gassen. You will find all of that there. You will find convenient links to places like Amazon and Tim's site directly to make or consider some purchases. And you will certainly be glad you did. And while you're on our website, we, of course, love the fact that you hopefully go back and look at or listen to some of our old episodes. They're all there for you for download or for streaming, whatever you want to do. And you also find all of our social media things there, too. So go to, let's see, on Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You can like us on Facebook. You can even send us email, for God's sakes. And that's hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. So pretty damn cool. And we look forward to many more episodes around the World Hockey Association. Hopefully we'll get into some of the specific teams, some wacky stories from some of the players and administrators. Yes, we are on the road to hopefully having a conversation with Dennis Murphy, who we look forward to tremendously to get to talk to, not only the WHA, but the 4 or 5 other Challenger leagues that he started up. But obviously the WHA being probably the most story filled. Oh, that's probably not true, because I mean the ABA was certainly something. And so whatever. But anyway, so he's on our list, and hopefully a few others as well. So there you go. Before we run, I also want to say thank you tremendously to our friends at Podfly Productions, including, of course, the good Dr. Jerry Payne and all his friends and colleagues there at Podfly. And of course, you can find them at podfly.net for all of your podcasting needs. Visit them and get serviced, shall we say, in good stead. All right, I am complete for this week. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, and I look forward to seeing you next week. So thank you so much, and we'll talk at you again next week. Bye.